The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
There is a little connection between the lateral and the third, and then we have the cerebral aqueduct, which is a bigger connection that's going to run from the third to the fourth. And that sits right in front of the cerebellum. Looks like a little triangle right on the half head. And then it connects to the central canal of the spinal cord. So all of the cerebral spinal fluid is constantly moving and it's constantly shifting, right? From the brain, from the ventricles to around the brain, right? There are going to be places where it can get out, then down into the spinal cord and back up and back into the arachnoid villus where we can get rid of it, kind of put it back into the blood, okay? And we make more. We make it constantly all the time. Okay? So here we are. If we're looking at a side view, we see the lateral, left and right. Here is your third. There's a little interventricular foramen where we're going to be able to connect the laterals with the third. Okay. And then we have the cerebral aqueduct, and then the fourth. Aqueducts are a way to get water from one place to another. Okay. So aqueduct. Think of aqua. Right? Aqueduct probably is a better way to say it. Water, right? But in this case, it's not exactly water, it's cerebral spinal fluid, moving it from one place to another. And then from the third, we're going to have some apertures, we call them. There are lateral and medial ones that are going to allow that to either then go into the subarachnoid space, and it continues down through the central canal of the spinal cord. So these apertures here, one here, two lateral, one medial, allow it to go into that subarachnoid space, and that's how it starts to go around the entire brain. So we've got lots of fluid in there. You could also think of these things as holes in your brain. So if somebody says you have a hole in your head, yeah, you do, right? Except it's filled with fluid. Right? When you cut the brains, you can see that little opening. You can't see the fluid anymore. The fluid's gone, but you can see sort of right where that corpus callosum is, that little space. Yeah, that was where the aqueduct was, the lateral one. Not the aqueduct, the ventricle, the lateral ventricle. Yeah.
Is that, so when they say it's a hole in the brain, is that like the foramen or valley or something like that? Or is it another name for it?
Well, foramen or foramen mean an opening. Okay, so those terms are used a lot. Probably the one that we think of, the one that we think of most of the time is where the spinal cord comes out of the occipital bone.
Yeah.
So we call that the foramen magnum.
Okay.
Okay. Foramina usually mean a little opening.
Yeah.
Foramen means a big opening, and you can put all kinds of different endings on those Latin words to kind of give them an idea of how big or small they are.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think of actual spaces, maybe not a hole, but spaces in your brain, yeah. These are just spaces that are filled with fluid. And obviously the biggest ones are the lateral ventricles. When you go into lab today, you should have in lucite some sections of an actual human brain. Okay? And if you look at the section where they do a cut this way, what we call this one is our sagittal. If we were going to do cut this way, right, and slice off a piece of this way, what would we call this? Coronal or frontal. And if you look at them, you can actually see the way they've sliced the brain in those lucite blocks. You can actually see where the openings are, where the spaces are, where those ventricles would be. And again, they're not empty. Obviously, once the brain is disconnected, fluid is going to leave. But you can actually see where those ventricles will be. So they're usually in the back, and they usually put them like in a little dissecting pan. And they're usually on the back counter. But you can actually see where those openings are then. Okay? So check that one out today. Alrighty. So, yeah, I like this picture. There's the spaces. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we do have spaces or holes. I don't know if you want to call it a hole, but, you know, when we were kids, we used to be like, you got a hole in your head. You know, yeah. No, you guys were nicer than we were when we were little. We were mean little kids. But there you go. So again, the way that they have done a cut in this one, how are they cutting it? Transverse. Yeah. So they cut through this way so that we could see these. I'm just testing you so you know the terms. Pretty cool. All right, so here you go. This is, these are kind of cool. These are real human brains, right? There are people who donate their bodies to science, and they do a lot of different things in order to provide these for teaching purposes. So we can see them. This is the one I was talking about where you can see in the back of the room, the one in lucite. Here we can see different cuts where we can see where they are. Now, here it would be right in here, right? Right underneath the corpus callosum. But once we cut it, you can't see it because it's just a space. Okay? All right, so the cerebral spinal fluid. There are certain spaces. Now, in the lab, you have a little model. It's gray, and it says these are the ventricles, right? And it actually kind of looks like looks like this, and it usually sits up on the front, okay? If you look at that, you are going to see some areas where it's red, okay? Those red areas are indicating blood capillaries. Okay, so there is this blood capillaries on the floor of the ventricles. You see it lining the cerebral aqueduct. You'll see some at the fourth ventricle. So take a look at it, turn it over, and see where the red is. That is what we call the choroid plexus. Now, the ependyma are the neuroglial cells that actually line the entire ventricles and cover over this choroid plexus. And what happens is the blood delivers the plasma. The ependymal cells take up the plasma, modify it, and then secrete it into the ventricles. Okay? If we were just talking about the ventricles. But wherever we have this choroid plexus, the ependymal cells directly underneath it are the ones that are going to modify the plasma to create the cerebral spinal fluid, and then secrete it into the ventricles, the third, the fourth, a little bit along that cerebral aqueduct. So take a look at the model and you'll see the areas that are red. That's where the choroid plexus is. And between the blood being delivered, well, not the blood, but the plasma being delivered through the blood and the ependymal cells, they are going to make cerebral spinal fluid. So it kind of looks like this. These are the ependymal cells. They line all the ventricles. And the little cilia on them keep the fluid kind of moving in the direction it's supposed to flow. Okay? But where we have this choroid plexus, this is where we are going to have the ependymal cells that are going to modify what's coming out of the blood, the plasma. Might be some nutrients, some ions, bunch of stuff. And then they're going to go through these ependymal cells, and then they will literally be modifying the plasma to make the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay. So take a look at that model. Look at the places where it would be. You should have a little of this on that half head model. You should see some of this choroid plexus, right? If you don't see it, ask Linnea to show you where it is, because I've seen that on the exam. I didn't say that though. Okay. So it's clear, it's colorless, right? It fills all the ventricles and canals, and it bathes the external surfaces of the brain and around the central nervous system. So it's in that subarachnoid space, right? It continuously flows around. It never stops. The production begins with the filtration of the blood plasma through the capillaries of the brain into those ependymal cells that modify the filtrate, and then boom, it gets delivered into the ventricles and the little canals, right? And then it moves all the way around. So again, it's a way to bathe, supply some things that might be needed, okay, to the cells. From the lateral ventricles, it flows through the interventricular foramina, or foramina, however you want to say it, into the third ventricle, and then through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth. So it's lateral, third, cerebral aqueduct, fourth. Okay. Both the third and the fourth ventricles are going to add a little bit more CSF. Again, when you look at that model, you'll see the red on it. It also then fills the central canal of the spinal cord. There are 2 lateral and 1 medial apertures. Aperture usually means opening, like in a camera. You have aperture, right? When it clicks, it opens and closes, okay? And that's where it's going to flow then into the subarachnoid space of the brain and spinal cord. Okay. It's going to be reabsorbed at those arachnoid villi into the superior sagittal sinus, and then it gets transported to the blood. So obviously it's on a continuous movement, which means we are constantly making it. Okay. As we take it out at the arachnoid villi into the superior sagittal sinus, we're replacing it as it's flowing through. Okay? So we could say that it starts at the lateral ventricles and then it ends there at the superior sagittal sinus. So this is a picture from your book, and it is showing you kind of how this flow works. So here we are. This is where your lateral ventricle would be, and we see lots of choroid plexes here. Okay. Here's your lateral, and there's your choroid plexes here. Here's your third. Here's your choroid plexes here. Right? There's a little interventricle foramen, a little opening where it flows from the lateral into the third. Then it goes down the cerebral aqueduct. There's some more choroid plexus here in the fourth ventricle, and then it flows down into the spinal cord, the central canal. Here's a lateral aperture. Here's the medial aperture. There's one on both sides, and that's where it flows out and into the subarachnoid space, and it's going to flow all the way around the brain, right? We're going to look for that superior sagittal sinus up here. Here are the arachnoid villi where the cerebral spinal fluid goes into the blood supply. Constantly making it. And it just flows. And it keeps flowing, gets transferred back into the blood, and we just keep doing it over and over and over again. There's that superior sagittal sinus again, and the arachnoid. Sometimes they call them granulation villi, but they're arachnoid villi where we are going to release it. There's lots of veins on this outer part here in the dura mater, and the cerebral spinal fluid goes into the veins and then back into the blood system. Okay. What is its function? Buoyancy. Yeah. It allows the brain to attain considerable size without being impacted by its own weight. It's almost like a pillow, right? Anybody float when they go in the lake or pool and you're just floating? It's sort of the same thing. Your whole body is sort of suspended in the fluid. Your whole brain is suspended in the fluid. And that allows it to be very heavy, just like your body is, and still be able to float, stay up on top of the water. So it kind of takes some of the weight away by allowing it to float, right? Anybody sink like a rock? You sink like, I float like a cork. I don't know what it is, but I just float. Put me in a thing of water and I'm just, I can't even keep if I'm sitting down, my legs just keep coming up. I just float. Yeah. So it's weird, but that's exactly what's happening to your brain. So the weight isn't impairing it. It can keep getting bigger and adding more what? More knowledge and more information without being impaired by that. Obviously, it's going to do some protection. It's not the best protection, okay? But yeah, every so often you jolt your head like this, right? Even doing this makes your head go back. Well, so is your brain is moving in there, right? So it's going to help prevent it from striking the cranium, the bones, when your head gets jolted. Now, severe jolting is going to cause a problem, okay? It doesn't protect from that, and that's how concussions occur. When your head is severely jolted, right? It can't help, and there could be some bleeding on the brain, right? Because you've broken some blood vessels now. So, but it does help, right? Everybody's bumped their head from time to time. Yeah, it hurts, but usually you don't do any brain damage. And it also helps with chemical stability, right? Nerves are constantly doing stuff, sending neurons, neurons are sending neurotransmitters to each other, and they're signaling, and they have to make those, and they have to get nutrients, but they also make a lot of waste products. So it helps to take away a lot of that waste products that are being made by the nervous tissue in the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have a way to get it back into the blood system so that we can filter it, do whatever we need to do, but supply things back to the ventricles so that they can make more cerebral spinal fluid. All right, blood flow. Woo! Blood flows to the brain via, all right, and we haven't talked about blood vessels yet, but two major ones, the vertebral and the carotid arteries. Do you remember when you were learning the bones and the cervical vertebrae, the transverse foramen had little holes in them, right? The transverse foramen. Yeah. That's where the vertebral vein is going to go, through those little openings in that transverse foramen. And then the carotid arteries are going to come right off of your heart, right? The big blood vessel that comes off of your heart to send blood to the body is called the aortic artery. And some of the first large arteries that come off of that are going to be your carotid. With the venous system, right, we're collecting the blood back after it's been delivered. All the nutrients and oxygen goes where they're going to go, and we're going to drain it back to the heart through the jugular veins. Okay. And the brain is only about 2% of adult weight, yet it receives 15% of the blood. Every time the heart is beating, 700 to 750 mils of blood per minute are going to your brain. Why? What do you think?
Needs the most.
It needs the most because what does it do? Controls everything. Yeah, right. Yeah, without our brain, we couldn't do any of our reflexes. We couldn't do anything. blood flow to the brain is always constant. If anything happens to you where you're losing blood, your body will shunt blood to the brain and stop shunting blood everywhere else, right? It'll stop, or we'll be able to block off arteries, close them off so we don't send blood to certain places. We always keep blood flow to the brain. Super important. Because your arms and legs can work, but if your brain isn't functioning, you can't move them. All right? So there's a lot of controversy about that. You're brain dead, meaning that your brain is no longer sending out the signals. Okay? So this is one of the reasons why we always keep blood flow to the brain constant. Neurons have a really high demand to make the energy molecule ATP. So therefore, they have to have tons of oxygen and glucose. So a really constant supply of blood is super important. And we'll talk about the veins and the arteries going to the brain coming up, right? A 10-second interruption of blood flow may cause you to faint, loss of consciousness. 1 to 2 minutes can be significant, right? Impairment of neural function. 4 minutes, irreversible brain damage. CPR, what are they doing?
Mimicking like the pumping of the heart.
Mimicking the pumping of the heart by doing all that pushing. Where's that keeping blood going? To your brain, okay? Because after 4 minutes, it can cause irreversible damage. Okay, so the blood-brain barrier. Yeah, we've talked about the neuroglial cells that make up the central nervous system. Astrocytes were one of them. Yeah. Blood vessels coming into the brain. These are little capillaries, the ones where we're going to be able to deliver nutrients and oxygen. Almost nothing gets into a neuron that does not go through an astrocyte. So all of these little extensions, they usually call them podocytes, that connect from the astrocyte to the blood vessels. And then from the blood vessels, it goes through the astrocyte, and then the astrocyte has these little connections with the dendrites and the cell body, and they deliver then what the neurons need. Okay? This is one of their major functions, to make sure that bad things do not get into the neurons. Are there exceptions? Yes. Right? But it wants to keep most of the harmful things from disrupting your brain function, right? Toxins, bacteria, anything that could be a problem. So we call this the blood-brain barrier because almost everything has to go through an astrocyte. It's kind of like, you guys know about medieval times where somebody always wanted to poison the king. So the king had a food taster, and the king wouldn't eat the food until the food taster was alive. Yes, right? You can kind of think of them like that, right? They're testing everything to make sure nothing bad gets into the neurons. There are some exceptions with drugs and alcohol. Alcohol can pass, can get past, I guess is a good way to say it, this blood-brain barrier. Okay? So there are things that can get through. Okay, now we're into the brain parts themselves. The brain stem. Okay. The brain stem, working our way upward, right, consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. And then there's something else. Sometimes it's considered part of the brain stem, and other times not. Depends on what book that you talk about. But your book is kind of mentioning this diencephalon. Okay. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But we are going to work our way upward. So we've talked about the spinal cord. Those neurons are coming up. We're going to go through the medulla oblongata. We're going to go through the pons, through the midbrain, and then into the diencephalon. All right, so the medulla oblongata begins at the foramen magnum, right? Everything below the opening in the occipital bone is going to be considered spinal cord. It extends about 3 centimeters rostrally toward at the back, about 3 centimeters. And it ends at a groove just below the pons. It is slightly wider than the spinal cord. And here we can see this area like this. A little bit wider than the spinal cord. Here's a picture from your book. Also, look at that half head model in the lab. Okay. There's a little groove here. So here we are looking at this one. What it has going up are these external ridges that are referred to as the pyramids. All nerve fibers, all connecting the brain to the spinal cord, pass through the medulla. So all axons going up or going down are going to pass through the medulla oblongata. Okay? So we usually leave oblongata off. We usually just call it the medulla. Okay. All right. What's in the medulla oblongata? The cardiac center. Ooh, this is the part that can adjust the rate and force of your heart. Beat faster, beat slower. Beat stronger. Don't beat so much. The vasomotor center, blood vessel diameter, right? We can make them smaller, we can constrict them, or we can dilate them. Constrict, dilate, constrict, dilate. Respiratory centers. Oh, I'm exercising. I need to start huffing and puffing. I need to breathe deeper to get more oxygen to my muscles. So, do I need to breathe faster? Maybe. Maybe just deeper. Maybe I need to do both. Now I'm resting. Do I need to breathe as deeply? No. So it's going to control the rate and depth of your breathing. We have tons of reflex centers in here. We have the reflex for coughing, for sneezing, for gagging, for swallowing, for vomiting, for salivation, for sweating, for movements of the tongue and head. And there's probably a zillion more. Not a zillion, but much more. Okay, these are just some of the major ones. Reflexes. Okay. One thing they all have in common, you have no control over them. Right? These are all the unconscious things that are happening all the time that you don't even think about. So here we are. We have the medulla, the pyramids in the front, all the neurons, well, I should say the axons of the neurons, the nerve fibers, remember the fiber is the axon, are going up, going down, they're all going through the medulla. We come up to the next part and we have the pons. The pons contains ascending sensory tracts and descending motor tracts. Pretty much these are the pathways in and out of the cerebellum also. Cerebellum is going to combine with the descending motor tracts to keep us moving nice and flowy. Yeah. It's going to help with our coordination, right? We don't move herky-jerky on a normal basis. We have grace, right? We can move nicely and smoothly. And that's what the cerebellum is going to do. So we have sensory going in and then being sent to the right part of the brain. And then we have motor coming out from another part of the brain. And these pathways are going to go in and out of the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is going to help us to coordinate all those muscle movements. It also has something to do with our respiratory regulation. Breathing in, rate of breathing and depth of breathing. It also has something that we call the reticular formation. there are some additional nuclei. In the brain, when we have a collection of neurons, the cell body, right? Cell bodies are collected in a little spot, right? In the spinal cord, we call them ganglion. Okay. In the brain, we call them nuclei. It's sort of the same thing. It's going to be a collection of cell bodies that send out then axons. This goes to all parts of the brain, and we call it the reticular formation, and it's involved with things like consciousness, sleep, respiration, and your posture. Am I standing up or am I sitting down? If I'm standing up, my head has to be up, my back muscles have to be contracting, right? If I'm sitting down, I have other muscles that need to be working. Right? Need to keep my head up, right? You know, well, when you're in class and your head's like this, and then you go like this, yeah, you can thank the reticular system for keeping you conscious, okay? This is the reticular system. It's weird. It goes everywhere. It's not a highly organized kind of structure, but we do know that it goes to all levels of the brainstem, right? We even get some information, right, when we have sensory coming up, motor going down. It all comes through here. It goes into the pons, and from there, it just kind of goes everywhere. It has connections with the midbrain and the diencephalon, and you know they hypothesize that there are about 100 small neural networks, and there's no real distinct boundaries here, right? They just kind of go everywhere in the brain. So again, sensory coming in, motor going out. It's probably a little bit more for that sensory stuff coming in and being sent to all different parts of the brain, because we interpret everything, right? Our brain interprets everything. Hot, cold, pain, sitting up, standing, my feet hurt, my clothes are on me. What? Gazillions of sensory information going in all the time, right? And it all is going to come in, and eventually it's going to go to the diencephalon, and then it gets sent out to where it needs to go. So these are all part of this reticular formation. It's not just one thing. It's a combination of all of these, creating these connections with all kinds of areas in the cerebrum. Right? And again, they hypothesize about 100 little networks here, and sending information to different parts of the brain. All right. So if we look at the back side, here we can see this is where the fourth ventricle is going to be, and here we have the pons. There are some connections that go into the cerebellum from the pons, and they call them peduncles. So those are coming up when we talk about the cerebellum, sorry. Okay? All right, then we move up into the midbrain. And the midbrain has these four little bulbous things, and you should have seen them on the sheep brain, right? When you kind of fold it this way a little bit, you see these four little bumps like this? Yeah. They're called colliculi. There are two superior, two inferior. So colliculus is plural. Colliculi is plural. Colliculus is singular. Okay. So each one is a colliculus. There are four colliculi, two superior, two inferior on the midbrain. And then again, we're going to have, it looks like these little ridges, and we have neurons going up and coming down, going up, coming down, ascending and descending tracks, passing through there also. Again, it's got the cerebral aqueduct, and that leads to the fourth ventricle from the third. It's got continuations of this reticular formation. Those four bulges collectively are called the corpora quadrigemina. Quadrigemina. Oy, 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 what a word. You know how long it took me to learn how to pronounce that? Yeah. Quadrigemina. Quadrigemina. Yeah. Gosh. And the two upper pair, superior, two lower pair, inferior. Okay. They do get some different information though. The upper pair function in visual attention and tracking moving objects. Oh, there it goes. Right. Yeah. And also scanning images. Right? You look at a picture on the wall, you kind of scan through it and you're like, oh, tree, leaves, branches, trunk, grass, duck on grass, people picnicking. Right? It allows you to scan through things and send that information to the brain. The lower pair receive information from the inner ear. Right? Somebody comes up behind you and goes, boo! And you jump. That's your startle reflex. Right? So something to do with sounds, sudden sounds. Okay? The reticular formation networks, and remember there's like 100 of them, right? Somatic motor control. They can help us to adjust muscle tension to maintain tone, especially with posture. Because you're not thinking about your posture, you're not thinking, I'm sitting up, so you need to have something that's helping you control that. Cardiovascular control. Yeah. It involves these cardiac and vasomotor centers in the medulla. Okay, so that's a part of this reticular formation. Pain modulation. This is one of the routes that we have for pains from the lower part of the body to reach the cerebral cortex or the cerebrum, where we interpret pain, that sensation of pain. What does it mean? So these are some of the functions that we're using this reticular formation from. The brain stem itself is kind of automatic, right? It's part of the autonomic nervous system. We have no control over what's happening in this part of the brain, right? So it's controlling things for us that is below our conscious awareness of them. Except for pain. We're usually always consciously aware of pain. Helps us with sleep and consciousness, right? Yeah. Woohoo. They have found that irreversible coma is somehow, right, connected to this reticular formation. Yeah, because if it is somehow injured by some sort of head trauma, yeah, he'd be in an irreversible coma. Habituation. You know, this morning when you got dressed, you probably took your jammies off and you were cold, and then you put your clothes on and you could feel your clothes touching your body, right? But after a while, you kind of forget you got clothes on, right? It's not important anymore to remember that you have clothes on. You have other things that are going on. You're getting in your car, you're driving, you're eating, you're listening, you're in class, you're doing this, you're doing that, right? So that stimuli that there's clothes touching your skin is really inconsequential. It doesn't matter, right? So we call that habituation. You're kind of become insensitive to the fact you got clothes on. But if somebody started pulling on your clothes, you'd all of a sudden, that's a different stimuli, right? Yeah. And now you're going to be more sensitive to somebody pulling than the fact that you just have clothes touching your skin. So this reticular formation network is going to help us to kind of weed out what signals coming through are important and which ones aren't. Which ones mean we need to do something and which ones, no big deal, doesn't matter. All right. Questions about the brain stem? All right, let's get coordinated. Make nice, graceful movements. All right, that's what our cerebellum helps us to do. It's the second largest part of the brain as a whole, but it contains more than half of all the brain neurons. They are estimating about 100 billion. It consists of right and left cerebellar hemispheres connected by a little thing that's called the vermis. I guess when they were doing this, vermis means worm. I guess it looks like the segments of an earthworm. Okay? So vermis means worm in Latin. So it just connects the left and right hemispheres. Okay? Once again, we've got mountains and we have valleys. Only these run a little bit differently. So they call this gyra on the outside of the cerebellum folia. That's the outer part where the cell bodies are, the cerebellar or cerebellar cortex. Inside of it is where all the neurons are. Well, axons of the neurons. This is all made up of neurons. The gray matter made up of the cell bodies, the fibers or white myelinated axons made up with myelin on them. So they call that the arbor vitae. So now that I really screwed that up, let's go to this picture. So here you are. All of the bumps are called folia. Outside is gray matter, all the cell bodies. And then we can see here where we have white matter. These are the axons of all of these cell bodies. Information in, information out. They call it the arbor vitae. Arbor means tree. Yeah. I don't know, when I was in school, we used to have Arbor Day, and we used to make all kinds of trees, and I don't know if they do that anymore in school. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, I don't know. But when I was in school, we always had an Arbor Day celebration, and our classes would make trees, and then we'd go into the auditorium, and we'd put up our trees and stuff. Okay? So that's how I understand the word arbor means tree. And this does basically look like a tree, right? It looks like here's the trunk and here are all the branches coming off of the tree. So arbor vitae, you should have seen that when you did your brain dissection. Yeah, it was pretty cool. You could actually see the difference in color in the cerebellum. These peduncles, oh, what a great word. I don't know what that means. There are 3 pairs of them though, okay, that go into the cerebellum and come out of the cerebellum. And obviously we're going to have lots of nerve fibers, axons in there. Okay? They're going to provide a lot of communication from the cerebrum and the brain stem. Okay? Going in, coming out. Going in, coming out. And we're going to involve the cerebellum in there. So here they are. There's 3 of them. Thick nerve bundles of the fibers that carry signals into and out of the cerebellum. Remember, everything coming in or going out is going to go through the medulla oblongata. As we move up into the pons and the midbrain, we are going to start to send those through the reticular system and other pathways to where they need to go. They're either going to keep going up into the cerebrum, or we could send some information to the cerebellum. We also need the cerebellum for input for muscle movements so that we can do that coordination. So, pathways of communication to and from the cerebrum and the brainstem, as well as carrying signals into and out of the cerebellum. So they're called the peduncles. Just know they're there, okay? So, input and output, here we go. Input from, let's say, a muscle through the spinal cord, right? We've also got some stuff from our eyes as well as hearing coming into. We're going up through the medulla. We're going to go through the pons. We're going to go here to the cerebellum. We're going to send information up to the brain. We're going to send information back down the same way. We have sensory stuff going up, right? So it's just input and output, right? Everything pretty much coming out of the cerebrum is also going to go through the cerebellum. Once again, we do a lot of motor movements through there, and that's going to help us with coordination, right? So brainstem, cerebellum, things we have usually no conscious control over, and they're taking care of those things for us. So there's a lot of coordination between the brainstem, the cerebellum, sending the information to the cerebrum and getting information back from the cerebrum. Functions, yeah, it monitors muscle contractions and aids in that coordination. I've mentioned that. It helps us do spatial perception and comprehensions of different views of a three-dimensional object. Is it the top, the bottom, the side? Can we rotate it? Can we turn it upside down? Right? So we're looking at a three-dimensional object in a lot of different ways. It's our timekeeping center. It predicts the movement of objects. You use this when you're driving. Can I make this turn, or is that car coming too fast? Will I be able to make my turn in front of it, or is it going to crash into me? Okay. So it predicts how much the eyes have to move to in order to compensate for head movements and remain fixed on an object. That car is turning in front of me. Do I need to put on my brakes? Yeah. Okay. So allows us to predict the movement of objects. And hearing. When we hear lots of different pitch. Or something really low. All right, so that's pitch, right? What is the high or low of it? But also, if familiar sounding words, right? Somebody says, "Oh, harm," and I'm like, "What happened to your arm?" How do I distinguish between arm and harm? They sound really close. So it helps us to make that distinction. The very top part of the brainstem is what we call the diencephalon. And it's going to enclose the third ventricle. So when we cut, right, your lateral ventricle would be here, your third ventricle would be right in here. Okay. We've got three things in here that are really important. The thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. Oh, I'm sorry. Forgot to silence my phone. You all get 2 extra points on the next exam.
All
All right. Yeah. Okay.
That's true.
I'm bad. Don't. You better not find my phone number and call me. That's my policy. If my phone rings, because I forget to turn it off, I'll give you 2 points on the next exam. So this is +2.
Don't forget.
Nobody better find my phone number, because then you'd be calling me every day. All right, back to the diencephalon. We've got the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. Okay. Now, what is not part of the diencephalon is this little thing hanging down from it that's called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is actually a part of your endocrine system, and we will get there. Okay. But it does have a connection to the diencephalon. Okay? So here's another picture from your book. or this may not be from your book, but it might be from another source. Very similar though. Here we go. Here's the thalamus. Here's the hypothalamus. There's the pituitary. And back here, right there, is the pineal gland. Or pineal gland. You may say it however you like. I learned it pineal. I'm sorry. That's how my professor said it. So that's how I usually say words. Okay. If you ever are confused, there's a website called howjsay, HOWJSAY.com, and you type in a word and they'll tell you how to say it. Okay? So, here's that diencephalon. The thalamus has two parts to it, and it is connected. Okay? The pineal gland is on the back side here, in the middle. Okay? And that's all you need to know there. Okay? So, two parts to the thalamus, and there's the pineal gland sort of in between the two parts. Here we are again. The thalamus is called an ovoid mass. It means it's oval shaped, right? And it is connected by what's called the intermediate mass. So when you do a cut through here, right, we're doing a sagittal cut, you see this little part right here, that's the intermediate mass, okay? And this is one half of the thalamus, the other half would be on the other side. The thalamus is called the gateway to the cerebrum. Nearly all input, sensory input, has to pass through the thalamus. And then it gets routed to the correct part of the cerebrum. And if it needs to, it can go to several parts all at the same time. This is how we can integrate information that's coming in. It all gets routed through this thalamus. And then the thalamus says it needs to go here, 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 and here. And it sends it where it needs to go. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and we'll probably come along with them. So, it projects what we call raw data as perceptions, okay? Where your brain then says, oh, okay, that's pain. Stop doing that. Or that's touch, or that's this, or that's that. Okay. It also is going to be kind of like a motor relay center between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So the information, when you want to move, goes from the cerebrum through the thalamus to the cerebellum, and then eventually we're going to send that signal to your muscles where we do everything the way we want to in a coordinated fashion. It is also involved in a lot of memory and emotional functions of what we call the limbic system. This is going to be another set of nuclei, collections of cell bodies. And their main function, is putting memory and emotions together. Have you ever, I can't eat eggs. I got sick on eggs once. And I just see an egg, and that memory of being so sick on eggs just comes back. So there's my limbic system saying there's an emotional attachment to that memory of being sick on eggs. Okay? Has any of that ever happened to anybody else? Yes. All right. So, and it could be, I'm sorry?
It's called food aversion.
A food aversion, that's one thing, yeah. But also, have you ever smelled something and you're like, oh, that smells like when Mom used to cook on Sunday. And it brings back memories of Mom cooking a dinner and everybody being around the table and having a good time, or fighting like crazy, like in my family, right? Throwing insults at each other and, Oh, come on, we've all done it. Right? So it brings back some emotions that go with the memories too. Okay? All right. So the hypothalamus is directly underneath the thalamus. Hypo means below, underneath, right? It forms some parts of the third ventricle too. So when we cut, we're cutting through the hypothalamus too. It has a little stalk that's called the infundibulum that is going to attach the pituitary gland to it. Okay? But the pituitary gland is not part of the diencephalon, but it is attached to it, right? Now, the hypothalamus is the major control center of the autonomic neurons and the endocrine system. Okay? And we haven't talked about what the autonomic nervous system is yet, but we will. Okay? It plays an essential role in homeostatic regulation of all body systems. Right? We talked about homeostasis, that set point in the brain where it has the information. This body temperature should be here. pH should be here. Blood glucose level should be here. Blood pressure should be here. This should be here. This should be there. Right? All those set points for homeostasis are contained in the hypothalamus. So, any information coming in to the thalamus regarding homeostasis gets sent to the hypothalamus. And it decides, am I within the range where everything's working the way it should, or am I not? If I'm not, I got to do something. If I am, I can ignore it. So all that homeostatic regulation of every body system is contained in the hypothalamus. Incoming information, it's measuring it, saying, yep, we're okay, stomach is okay, muscle okay, blood vessel okay, this is okay, pancreas okay, small intestine okay, everything's okay, I don't got to do anything. But it's constantly reviewing and looking at all that information. So, here we are again. The thalamus, the hypothalamus. All of this would be making up that third ventricle. And there's that infundibulum, this little stalk, and then the pituitary gland would be attached to it there. It secretes hormones. Any hormone that goes out of your body, and we're going to come back and talk about this a little bit more. Growth, metabolism, reproduction, stress responses, you name it, everything that has to do with hormones is going to go through the hypothalamus to the pituitary. It literally controls the pituitary gland. Autonomic effects, these are, again, things that we have no control over, right? Heart rate, blood pressure, gastrointestinal secretions, motility, and all other kinds of things, right? So again, we can kind of think of homeostasis. Thermoregulation. This is where your body's thermostat is. Too hot, too cold. Food and water intake. Take food. Hunger and satiety. Satiety means you're not hungry, right? Are located here. They monitor blood glucose, amino acids. They can produce sensations of being hungry or being full. All of this. Your thirst center. When you're thirsty, you're out of homeostasis. It's one of the first things that happens if your water balance is off. You get thirsty and you want to drink a lot. There you go. Okay. Sleep and circadian rhythms. Yeah, there's a certain nucleus, collection of cell bodies, that sits right above the optic chiasm. Yeah. That helps, again, with our 24-hour cycle, along with another gland, the pineal gland. Okay. Memory. There are mammillary nuclei that receive some signals from another nucleus called the hippocampus that help us with memory. Emotional behavior and sexual response. Aggression, fear, pleasure, contentment, sexual drive. All that come out of this one little area of the brain. So it's involved in a lot of homeostatic as well as memory and emotional behavior responses. The pineal gland, sometimes it's also called the epithalamus. Hypothalamus below, epi above, epithalamus. I haven't heard it called that in a long time, but your book mentions it, so I just wanted to let you know. And it sits right back here. If this is the hypo, that's the epithalamus. So hypothalamus, pineal gland. It is considered an endocrine gland that secretes melatonin. Melatonin is what's going to control our rhythm of sleep and wake. Okay? Again, along with the hypothalamus, it's involved in that 24-hour, we call it the circadian rhythm of activity. Although it's not exactly 24 hours, we've rounded up. Our body usually works on a 23-hour, 45-minute cycle, but we rounded it up to 24 hours. Okay? And then there are also the mammillary bodies that are down here that help to relay signals from the limbic system to the thalamus and are involved in memory also. So this is all things, right? No real control, right? It's all things that are happening for us. Right? We're not thinking about it. We don't have to worry about it. It's all kind of the automatic part of the brain that takes care of all those things for us that we don't need to worry about. And then we get to the cerebrum. This is where we think. We have perception. We have thought. We have memory. Judgments. We do voluntary motor movements, moving our muscles. Okay. Yeah. It's the largest and obviously the most conspicuous. Right? We know we have the two hemispheres. We have the longitudinal fissure that divides them in half. The lobes are named after the bones, so you already know the names of the lobes, right? Parietal, frontal, occipital, temporal. So you know the lobes already, okay? But this is what makes us us. This is our personality. This is everything else. This is where we store all of that stuff. Okay? There is one other lobe that's kind of hidden deep inside, right? Whoops. Whoops, whoops, whoops. Where is it? There it is. The insula. Okay. So you've got the frontal, the parietal, occipital, temporal, and then we'd actually have to move these apart, which is what these two things are doing. The insula is inside there. Okay, so there's actually 5 lobes. Each hemisphere. Okay? All right, let me go back here. Whoops, too far. Cortex. Cortex is the outer part. Gray matter. Cell bodies. Information goes in to the outer part, the cortex. Information comes out of the cortex, goes down axons, to the thalamus, to the cerebellum, through the spinal cord, or I should say through the medulla to the spinal cord. Okay. Gyra fissures, sulci, you know all of those, right? Anybody have questions about them? Okay. Yeah, contains billions of neurons up there. Yeah. They're connected though, the two hemispheres. Yes, they don't operate independently. We have that corpus callosum, which actually is bundles of axons connecting the left and the right half. Okay? So, you know all the gyra and the sulci. You're all good with that, right? There's that corpus callosum. You know the lobes, right? Anybody have questions on those? All right. Here it is. That's the corpus callosum. And look at all the fibers passing back and forth. That is the coolest picture. Wow. Yeah. It's happening right now in your brain. Scary, isn't it? All right. We're good with the lobes? I'm gonna skip over that, all right? But the frontal lobe has voluntary motor functions. I want to move my muscles. I want to walk over there. That's where it's going to originate from. It also is where we have motivation, foresight, planning, memory, mood, emotion, social judgment, decision making, and aggression. Okay? It's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what's going on in one part of the brain. Okay? We use all parts of the brain whenever we're doing anything. But when they put those electrodes on people and they ask them to do certain tasks, they found that these are the areas that light up the most when we're doing certain things. So this is how we assign these what would you call them? Categories, right? I mean, what do you call memory? What do you call foresight, judgment? Functions? Yeah, it's like whatever makes you you. Yeah. There's all of these things usually light up in the frontal lobe. Are other parts of the brain lighting up too? Yes. Okay, so, but, we've kind of said, this is where most of these things are happening. Okay? The insula. The insula helps you to understand spoken language. Ooh. There's a special place in there called Wernicke's area that allows you to understand language. It helps with taste, integrating information from your visceral receptors, stuff on your organs, and cardiovascular homeostasis. It also plays a role in pain perception, empathy, and emotions. Right? When we talk about empathy, can you feel what other people are feeling? Or are you one of those non-empathetic people? Where you're like, ooh, glad it ain't me. The parietal lobe integrates your general senses, taste, and some visual information. So general senses, touch, texture, some pain too, a little bit of everything, pretty much. The occipital lobe, vision. It has everything to do with vision. Seeing things, color, tracking movements of things, looking at things, their three-dimensional shape, anything that has to do with vision, something's happening in that occipital lobe. Your temporal lobe, hearing mainly, but smell, learning, memory, and some aspects of emotion. So you can see, it's hard to pinpoint what part of the brain does just one thing. It's spread out all over the place. Okay. All right. Just a little mention about this hippocampus. We kind of mentioned it before, and the fornix, because I think fornix is on your list, right? The hippocampus is very deep within the brain. They're hypothesizing, and I'm not sure if they know for sure, that it has a major role in learning and memory. But we also have learning and memory up here. But maybe it helps us to consolidate some of those and send it to the cerebrum. But it's called the hippocampus. It's down here. And then it has this extension that comes up like this. And that's your fornix. And the fornix means arch in Latin, so arch. And it's a bundle of nerve fibers in the brain that act as the major output tract of the hippocampus. So information comes in, information goes out. And maybe this fornix is sending the information to parts of the cerebrum where we are storing those memories, storing those lessons we've learned. Okay. But these are deep parts in the brain. All right? that's kind of all of our gray matter. Okay. Questions? No? And I'm trying to keep it super simple and straightforward. Okay. All right. So the white matter, if it's white, it means myelin. If it's myelin, it's always going to be an axon because cell bodies never have myelin on them. Okay. So there's so much white matter that we have different tracks, we call them. Right? We have projection tracks. It carries information between the cerebrum and the rest of the body. We have commissural tracts, which are crossing from one hemisphere to the other. Basically, we're going through the corpus callosum. Okay? And then the last track we have are called association tracts. As I said, it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where things are happening. So, we're in the same hemisphere, but we can, connect things within a lobe, or we connect things between different lobes. Oops, I put in a return there, sorry. So the different lobes within a particular hemisphere are connected to each other too. So we can go from frontal to parietal, frontal to temporal, frontal to occipital, occipital to parietal. So we've got these tracks that are connecting all of the lobes in one of the hemispheres. We have the ones that connect only within a single lobe. So we call them long or short. Okay, so association. And again, this is how it makes it hard to say, well, this only happens here. No, it happens in a lot of places in the brain. There's all these connections. So here you go. So association tracks, right? So within a lobe or between lobes, okay, we have the commissural tracts. That's basically the corpus callosum. So commissural goes with corpus callosum. All the C's go together. Okay. Yeah. And then we have the projection tracts. Right? These are the ones that are going to go down. They're going to go down into the brainstem and down into the spinal cord. So they're projecting downward or upward. The commissural are always going to be corpus callosum, so the C's go together. And then the association tracts are associating information within the lobe or between lobes. All right, this is a cool picture too, because we can actually see on a real brain. Here they are. We know the corpus callosum, but here we can see these association going from here over here, right? You can't see the, well, you can see some of the projection tracts. You can't see them going down, but you can see them coming from the cortex, coming downwards, which means they would eventually make their way all the way down and then into the spinal cord. So they're kind of running this way. The association tracts kind of look like they're looping because they're looping within the lobe or between lobes. And then, of course, just the corpus callosum is connecting the two. That's a cool picture, though. I like that one. And there's that corpus callosum again. Woo! I love this picture. I don't know. I put it in twice. It's fun. Okay. All right. So, the cerebral cortex. This is really complicated, and I don't think it's anything that you really need to know. But for any exam right now, okay, unless you're going to become a neurosurgeon, I wouldn't worry too much about this. I am not going to test you on it, but I just wanted you to know that the cortex contains between 14 to 16 billion neurons. And it's called neural integration, okay? So we've got lots of cells in here that are making connections between different parts of the cerebral cortex. Some of these are going to be our association neurons running from in the white matter, but this is the cortex. And as you can see, there are a whole variety of cells that make up, right, the cortex. So it's not just one cell body and one neuron, right? We've got lots of things going on here, right? And it's very complicated. There are a whole variety of cells, and I just don't think it's something you need to know at this point, okay? You'd remember this or memorize it, and then you'd forget it before you actually ever needed it, all right? So I just want you to know that the cortex is not just a cell body with one axon coming off of it. We've got lots of things that are going on in that cerebral cortex, and that's all you need to know for now. If you're really interested, you can read about it in the book, okay? All right, but we do have what are called some basal nuclei. Once again, this is a collection of cell bodies, right? They're buried very deep down in the white matter. So in that white stuff around here, right, around where we have the ventricles, okay, and it's buried deep inside. So we have a set of these cell bodies. Technically, they're called the basal nuclei. They're made up of 3 different types of things, okay? We've got the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus, okay? And these separate areas filled with bodies, with the neuron cell bodies, okay? They receive input from the midbrain and the motor areas, and they can send signals back to both locations. And they're going to be involved in motor control, moving muscles. Okay? So they're referred to as the basal nuclei. You don't need to know all the names of them. You just need to know that we do have these basal nuclei, collections of cell bodies buried deep in that white matter. Okay? The limbic system, we mentioned this. It's spread out to a variety of areas. It's really important for emotion and learning. In fact, they call it the emotional center of the brain. A lot of strong emotional responses also impact memory. Eggs for me, okay? The limbic system has centers for both gratification and aversion. I don't want that. I have the aversion, right? Now, put me in a store with really cool shoes, and that is gratification. Anybody else a shoe horse? Yeah. And then I teach classes where all I can do is wear these closed-toed shoes. Okay. I know. I was cool as sandals. I'm teasing. But gratification and aversion. Okay, so the limbic system is very, involved in this. And sometimes aversion is fear, right, or just sadness. I don't want to go near that. My fear is vomiting. Bad. Okay. Just before lunch too, right? Okay. So the limbic system. Yeah, it's kind of all over the place. Okay. So once again, it's really hard to kind of just say, oh, this is where it is. It's all over the cerebral hemispheres. It's in the diencephalon too, right? There are more different types of, here's that basal nuclei, here's the hippocampus, there's the fornix. It's just kind of spread all over the place. So again, we know so little about the brain, really. We really don't. And this seems like a ton of stuff, but we're still not even, like a quarter of the way of understanding how all this stuff happens. Emotion and feelings, once again, we usually talk about the prefrontal cortex, so the frontal lobe, but the really early part of it, the front part of it, the front part of the frontal cortex, they call it the prefrontal cortex. And again, by putting electrodes on people and other animals, they have been able to figure out what's going on here, right? But again, judgment, intent, and control over expression of emotions. I mean, I can't tell you how many times my dog has like chewed up my shoes and I'm like, I'm gonna kill you! But I'm never gonna do that. I'm saying that, but I have control over that. I'm mad and like I want to beat him up, but I'm never going to do that. He's my dog, right? Maybe you've had that with younger siblings. Touch my stuff again and I'm going to beat you to a pulp. But you don't really do it, right? So we get this expression of emotions, but we do have control over actually carrying out whatever it is we're going to say, right? And again, the feelings, we're going to be looking at some of the hypothalamus and the limbic system and the nuclei. The basal nuclei can help to generate feelings of love or hate. I like this. I'm scared of this. Whatever it is. And as you can see, emotions are spread out in all kinds of parts. Sounds, right? Certain kinds of sounds can bring back emotions. Smells, tastes, right? Experiences. So many things are involved with the emotions. But, the prefrontal cortex is pretty important because it kind of gives you your personality. And if that is damaged by a head injury, a lot of times you'll say, that person just isn't like what they used to be, right? They've changed. There's something different about them, right? Maybe they used to be very empathic, and now they're not. They don't care anymore. Or their judgment's changed. Maybe they used to be very conservative, and now they're just wild. I'll do anything. Okay? So this is usually where we find an injury in that prefrontal cortex that might change the person's personality as we define it. The limbic system gets all kinds of sensory input, right? Food intake, sexual behavior, drawing attention to novel stimuli, something new. I've never seen that before. Isn't that cool? Okay. Some of the output is going to go to the hypothalamus, influencing, some of the somatic and visceral motor systems. Like your heart gets excited. I haven't seen my boyfriend for 3 weeks. And all of a sudden you get all excited because now you see him. So heart racing, blood pressure can make your hair stand on edge. It can also induce vomiting if it's really bad. Yes. Other output to the prefrontal cortex is important in the expression of emotions and the control over them, right? Your ability to express love, to control anger, or overcome fear. So all of these things. Behavior that we have is shaped by all of these different learned associations between stimuli, what we're exposed to, our responses to them, and we have to remember there's also usually a reward or punishment for the results. Okay? Mom told me not to do that. I did a bad thing. Okay? Was there a punishment or a reward? Did I get spanked? If I did something good, if you get all A's on your report card, you get $5 to go to the store and buy anything you want, right? So, we learn. Our behavior is learned by all of these things. What's the stimulus? How do we respond to it? And did we get a punishment or a reward? Okay? And it continues on to adulthood too, right? The rewards and the punishments are different, but there's still usually something that comes up from that. Higher brain functions, sleep, memory, cognition, all of this stuff involves interactions between the cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, the brainstem. I've been saying this all along. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where. So we can't really kind of define these anatomical boundaries between where things are happening. It's all integrative function when it comes to the brain, okay? But most of that's going to happen in the cerebrum, okay? So we use the term cognition, the range of mental processes by which we acquire and use knowledge. First we have to acquire it. We have to integrate it, and then we can use it. Okay? So we refer to that as cognition. All right, and that's a good place to stop. All right. Hopefully we did some review for Thursday. Okay. And And again, if you come with questions on Thursday about any questions you have about the lab exam,
Good luck with today's lesson.